Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the webcast, 6 Essential Steps to Prepare for New Global Game-Changing Data Rules Heading Your Way this May, sponsored by Sage Business Cloud People. Before we begin, I would like to remind you that this webcast has been pre-approved for HRCI credit and can also be used for SHRM credit. Please be sure to attend the complete webcast in order to receive your credits. After the webcast, you will receive an email from hr.com within 1 to 2 business days. It will include the certification credit information. You can also log in to hr.com and go to your View My Credits page, where you can see the credits that you have received. If you have any questions today for our presenter or for hr.com, please type them into the Questions tab on your GoToWebinar control panel, and we will follow up with you. And now it's my pleasure to turn it over to our presenter, Ganya Shaughnessy.
Thanks, Kathy. Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining our webinar today. 6 essential steps to prepare for the new global game-changing data rules, which are coming into effect this Friday. So here's the agenda for today's webinar. Some context around GDPR. What is GDPR? Why should HR leaders care about GDPR? What's new about GDPR, and 6 steps for GDPR readiness, and then just what's next. So who am I? My name is Grania, and I'm one of the global product marketing managers at Sage. I'm really passionate about looking at technology and how it disrupts our everyday lives. I'm passionate about how technology is shaping our world and our economy, and I've been lucky enough to have worked in the tech space for several years now, and just looking at how technologies can help businesses achieve explosive growth. More recently, I joined Sage Business Cloud People, and they are a modern global cloud HR and people platform that helps fast-growing multinational organizations transform not only how they actually acquire new employees, but how they retain them, manage them, and engage the workforce throughout their entire employee journey. Disclaimer here. So I just need to point out that the information contained in this webinar is for general guidance purposes only, and it should not be taken for, and it's not intended to be legal advice. So I just want to stress that if you're worried about anything or you're just unsure, then you should make your own detailed investigations or seek your own legal advice. But this should hopefully give you some insight into why HR and people leaders should care about GDPR. So before we get into the specifics, I thought we'd take a look at the context. So there's a really nice quote from Elizabeth Denham, the Information Commissioner. So with the rise in technology and how data is captured and shared, she says a lot of people feel that they've lost control of their own data. People feel that keeping control of their most important information used to be a lot more easy and simple to keep control of, but actually over more recent years, the sense of power over their personal information has flipped. Every day, we all use various different types of apps for different reasons, and sometimes we're not always aware of the data which is being captured or even shared. And the recent uproar surrounding Facebook serves to highlight the concerns the new rules are meant to address. What are our organizations doing with our data? Where does it end up? And how can we take back some of that control around our own data? And what GDPR is doing is creating an onus on companies to understand the risks that they create for others and to mitigate those risks and to work from a framework that can be used to build a healthy data culture. Hopefully that gives you some context, and now we'll look at what GDPR is. So GDPR is the EU's new general data protection regulation. It comes into effect on Friday. However, the fact remains that many organisations won't be compliant by then, and even for those who have been preparing for months and years, and they've got everything on track, 100% compliance is a very tall order. However, the regulator, the Information Commissioner's Office, or the ICO, is expecting all organisations that might be affected by GDPR to do their best to comply. GDPR was approved by the EU Parliament on the 14th of April 2016, and it replaces the 1995 Data Protection Directive, which was adopted at the time when the internet was really at its infancy. And the rules apply to the personal data of individuals who are residents in the EU, not just citizens. So it could be someone from the US who's living and working in EU member state. The purpose of the GDPR is to harmonise data protection laws across all of the member countries. It makes it easier for EU citizens to understand how their data is being used and if they need to raise any complaints. And it's really about reshaping the way organisations approach data privacy. And the risk for non-compliance is pretty serious. There are possible stiff fines, reprimands, and it can damage a company's reputation and its brand. And I'll cover in a little bit more detail shortly what the fines look like. So essentially, if your organisation collects personable, identifiable information, so for example, a candidate's resume or employees' information like bank details so they can get paid, who are based in the EU, then the data would have to be protected GDPR style. So going forwards, companies who do not respect personally identifiable information will run the risk of getting sort of a bad reputation and losing out potentially to competitors and organisations who build a good data privacy policy countrywide and distill the principles of GDPR to ensure their data is protected. So also in 2016, so around the same time, the EU and US Privacy Shield replaced the old Safe Harbour Agreement. So the main points to call out here is the 4 pillars of the framework, which have been agreed by the US Department of Commerce and European Commission to provide companies on both sides of the Atlantic with a mechanism to comply with EU data protection requirements when transferring personal data from the EU to the US. So joining the Privacy Shield is voluntary. However, once you've joined, you are making a public commitment to comply to those requirements. The framework allows businesses to transfer data from the EU to the US. However, those companies still need to comply with GDPR. The 4 pillars, as you can see on screen at the moment, so companies have got an obligation to have rigorous rules for data transfer in place. The government will have limited access, and responsibilities include, which is quite similar to the GDPR, is you have to have replied to any complaints within 45 days, and it must be free of charge. And there's an annual joint review mechanism for both the EU and the US. So to recap, the EU-US Privacy Shield allows you to transfer data from the EU to the US. However, you still need to comply with the General Data Protection Regulation. So I'm going to run a quick poll at this point. Kathy, could we take a moment here just to ask the audience to what extent do you feel GDPR ready? So we've got very prepared, partially prepared, not very prepared, nowhere near prepared, or it might not be applicable to you. So considering GDPR comes into effect this Friday, I'm hoping the poll is slanted more towards prepared, but if you're with us today, you might still have some concerns or need some more information. And GDPR is not going away after Friday. It's not going to be something which just disappears. Businesses will really need to work towards this data privacy by design on an ongoing basis. Cool. Let's leave that running for a few more seconds. Cool. Kathy, if we could close it there, let's see some of the answers. Oh, there we go. Okay. So we have got some people that are prepared. We've got 26% now saying not very prepared, which, as I mentioned, I think it's going to be an ongoing process that a lot of companies are going to have to go through, and it's not just a HR problem, it's across the whole organization. So it involves IT, it involves management getting on board and making sure that you really look holistically at how you process personal data, whether that's consumer information, whether it's employee information, and just really making sure everything's transparent as possible. Cool. Okay, so thank you for taking time to answer. Let's go back into some more details about GDPR. So within the GDPR, they refer to 3 different stakeholders, which you need to understand the classifications for. So data subject, this can refer to customers or consumers, but from a HR perspective, we're talking about candidates or employees. The individuals which the personal data actually relates to within the context of your organization. Then we have data controller, which is the organization handling the data of the data subjects. And then the data processor, which is the stakeholder which acts upon the instructions of the data controller. So for example, Sage Business Cloud People is a HR provider. So we are the data processor. Our customers are the data controllers, and the employees of the organizations that are our customers are the data subjects. There we go. So there's some key considerations when it comes to GDPR. So first up, we have scope, and there's 2 different kinds of scope. So we have material scope, which is about processing of personal data, wholly or partly, which form part of a filing system or are intended to be part of a filing system, so keeping it on record. And then territorial scope, so that's anyone processing the personal data of EU residents, not just companies located in the EU. Consent, so this must be freely given, specific, explicit, and unambiguous. The employee agrees to the processing of their personal data by a statement or a clear affirmative action. So right of access, this is about giving greater transparency and empowerment, and confirmation that their data is being processed, how and why, and right to access their own personal data. Information allows individuals to be aware of and actually verify the lawfulness of the processing of their own data. Data portability, which is another big thing, and this is actually a big change from the data protection agreement. So this allows individuals to actually obtain and reuse their personal data across different services. So they should be able to move, copy, or transfer personal data easily from one IT environment to another. So you know, in an Excel spreadsheet or something like that, they should be able to access any personal information that you hold about them, so they can carry that to another organization. So if an employee is leaving your organization, for example, they should be able to request all of their personal information in a machine readable format like a spreadsheet file, and take that with them. Essentially, it's theirs, it belongs to them. Breach notifications is another big thing that's part of the GDPR, and it just companies need to report certain types of personal data breaches to relevant supervisory authorities within 72 hours of becoming aware of the breach where feasible. They must inform the individuals who have been, their data has been breached, and if a high risk of adversely affecting individuals' rights and freedoms, that's important that they must know as soon as possible and what's happened. And also, at the same time, you have to keep a record of any personal data breaches, regardless of whether you are required to notify or not. So there are a range of different penalties, as I mentioned earlier. So failure to implement measures to ensure privacy by design. So this is ensuring data protection is considered in the early stages of a project and throughout its life cycle. So fines can be up to 10 million euros or 2% annual global turnover, whichever is higher. Things which might get included in this failure are things like failure by a controller in relation to the engagement of processors, failure of a processor or process of data in accordance with the controller's instructions, and failure to meet basic processing conditions obtaining consent can be much more significant. So the fines for this can be up to 20 million or 4% annual global turnover, whichever is higher again. And these failures include infringement of the rights of the data subjects, and international transfers of personal data being done incorrectly or without the knowledge of the data subject, and failure to implement or adherence to a subject access request for process. So if someone requests to have their processing suspended, or they get denied a request or something like that, these are the failures that are pretty big and they carry some pretty big fines. Other fines and penalties include warnings. Some companies might get warnings, a bit of a slap on the wrist, or reprimanded. You might get a temporary or permanent ban on data processing in order for whatever problem has arisen to be rectified, and compensation claims for damage for people that have suffered in the data breach, for example. They could then actually raise some claims against the organisation. So we're talking a lot about personal data, but what is personal data? What is it? So when we're talking about employee data, there's a huge range of things that you'd expect to see. So name, date of birth, passport number, email address, but it can also go into special categories of employee personal data like sexual orientation, political opinions, and religious beliefs, which people might not want to share widely. Then interestingly, with the technology advances that we've had, it's now starting to look at things like cookies, CCTV images, mobile devices, or mobile device IDs, social media. So there's so many things that constitute as personal data. And essentially it's any information, any data which is identifiable to a person. So as you can see here, so we've got another quote from Elizabeth Denham. And when it comes to data protection, this applies to small businesses too. A large organisation might get prepared and handle GDPR differently, but the risk and reliability is just as big. You can't think, we won't be ready in time. All we can do is just sit and wait and be fined. The risk of this is low, but what is more likely to happen is the ICO will begin by auditing and, if necessary, fining large, high-profile organisations which are the subject of data breaches or legitimate complaints from members of the public. We can expect probably to see a few landmark cases in the coming months as the new regulations are tested. However, this is no reason for organisations below the ICO's immediate radar not to attain compliance as soon as reasonably possible. And no one wants to be the subject of the first test case anyway. And we had a customer event about a month ago, which we talked about GDPR a lot. It's a big concern for a lot of HR leaders. And we had about 100 people at the event, all sat around tables, and we asked them to tell us what their 3 greatest challenges when it comes to being ready for GDPR. And what's really good to see here is that there was some consistencies in what people's concerns are. I think one of the biggest things to note that was going around the room that day was understanding. So the articles in the GDPR can come across as not always clear, or people are unsure of the meaning. So, what do HR leaders actually need to do? What are the wider business implications? And then data, in that word cloud that you can see there, data is at the centre of this, of course. But, what is the data that HR manages that is fundamental to making sure that HR are paving the way for being compliant and building a data privacy culture? What's the other other functions that need to be involved in some of the decisions that get made? So it might be your IT department working with your HR team and looking at the type of software that you're using. It's going to be working with your web team and looking at how you actually capture applications on your website. It's going to be looking at how you look at working with recruiters and how you actually receive CVs and resumes, and how you handle capturing consent when you do that. And this all leads into processes. So what are the new processes that you're going to build? Are you liaising with your legal department? If you don't have a legal department, are you liaising with outside counsel that can help you really make sure that you've got some ironclad processes which stand up against the new GDPR regulation? So, Kathy, we're going to ask another poll here, please. So, which of these concern you the most? So this is the same question that we asked our audience at our event a couple of months ago. You know, what is the biggest concern when it comes to data protection for your organization? Is it managing consent and how you capture consent? Is it the right to be forgotten? Is actually looking at how you give your employees that right to be forgotten? How do they make that request? What's involved in actually getting all of that data to be forgotten? Making data portable. Is it easy at the moment for you to use a system to download all of your employee information and actually give it to them in a machine readable format? Is it managing data access, or keeping employees clearly informed? And I think, you know, the heart of GDPR for me is about creating transparent processes. So as a HR leader, I think it's really important to really document all of the processes that you have when it comes to candidates and employees, and making sure that the processes that you build as an organization working with all of the other functions is as transparent as possible. Okay, so results. Managing consent, which I think is a big concern, because at what points do you ask for consent, and how do you actually manage the tracking of that and the audit trail? Right to be forgotten is quite large there too as well, which is interesting, because I think what we've heard a lot from our customers is actually unpicking where all the information lives and how you actually can make sure that it's truly forgotten. And managing data access. So that's interesting to see as well. We've at Sage People, we've got quite a nice platform where you can have a self-serve portal which has all of your employee information in it, and they can actually access their own personal information to a certain level, and you can give them access to the information you want them to have, which makes it a lot easier for that request. And keeping employees clearly informed, I think, is a big part of it, because if you have to communicate something with your employees, then you have to understand the processes, and that becomes transparent. So cool. Thank you everyone for taking part in that poll. So we'll get on to the nitty gritty. So what steps can you take for GDPR readiness? We've put together 6 steps that give you an idea of things that you need to think about when it comes to creating those transparent processes with GDPR in mind. So the 6 steps are having a lawful basis for processing data. So you need to know what data you have and how you're processing it. Have the right to consent in place. So make sure you have the necessary consents for the personal data that you're holding, and then ensure individual right to access. So keep your people informed, give them visibility and control of their personal data, and then allow for data portability, so they can take their data with them, just like they take the stuff from their desk when they leave a job as well. And then ensure the right to be forgotten, enable the deletion of personal data, while keeping the legitimate data that you need or you might need in the future. Also keep your people's data safe and secure, which seems quite simple, but you need to really ensure that the people data you've gathered is ideally in a single, verifiable, and consistent source of the truth. So, step 1, having a lawful basis for processing personal data. As an employer, you must have a valid, lawful basis to gather and process personal data. It is lawful if at least one of the following applies. So the individual has given consent for one or more specific purposes. It's necessary for a contract to which the individual is party or will soon to be, so your employment contracts. There's a legal obligation which must be complied with, so the submission of tax records by a business, for example. Processing the data is of vital interest to protecting someone's life. There's a task that's in the public interest or is carried out in the interest of official authority. It's necessary or legitimate interest, except where overridden by the interests, fundamental rights and freedoms of the individual. So the key essentials to this having a lawful basis for processing personal data is, compliance begins with that lawful basis piece. So consider how you will capture and record the lawful basis underpinning personal data that you're processing. So have you captured that? Have you documented it? Send communications to candidates and new hires advising of the lawful basis for processing their personal data. This is a really good opportunity to set up triggers, to send communications to your entire workforce for any new lawful bases identified in the future. I know I've received some notifications from my employer. I've received loads of emails from different companies which are now actually getting you to opt into their email marketing communications, for example, and stuff like this. So it's actually a chance to reach out and find out who's actually opening those emails, who's paying attention to those communications, because you now, as an employer or HR leader, you need to make sure that they have agreed to the communication that you're sending out. So then you also need to track that, track those sorts of information. So you've got that audit trail from a lawful point of view. Sharing privacy information and send privacy notices in advance to notifying employees of their rights and details of how their personal data will be used. So this does not just apply to new employees, this applies to existing ones too. So this is an overhaul of your core processes that needs to be communicated, and it applies to the personal data that you hold today. Step 2. Have the right consents in place. So this was a big concern for you, some of you at the beginning of this webinar in the poll that we took, and a lot of candidate and employee data captured for processing will be required for contractual, legal or legitimate interests, such as personal details needed for communications or tax and payment purposes. In other cases, employers will need to review how they seek, manage and review any necessary consent, including consideration of whether existing consent needs to be reviewed if they fail to meet GDPR standards. From the moment a candidate submits a CV or application form, you'll have to start to record when and how you obtain this data and on what lawful basis you hold it. And this may be consent, in which case you have to have it documented. Have you got this documented somewhere? Because this needs to form an audit trail that you can tie back to. And a lot of employees keep an eye on the talent pool in regards to even just speculative sent CVs as a long-term asset in the battle to recruit the best people. So in what consents do you hold these speculative resumes? This all needs to be thought about. So key considerations for consent: you need to ensure that you know clearly how you will collect, process, manage and share personal data, and more importantly, how you will capture and manage consent. So you need to capture consent for individuals as necessary, and it needs to be freely given and positively captured. So opting in rather than being automatically opted in. Ensure that your workforce have provided any necessary consents and that they can view and access a record of this. Allow employees to change and update consent for their personal data. So we live in a world where we can do our internet banking through our app and transfer money and check how much money we've got in our savings. This is all at the tips of our fingers, and being able to give your employees the ability to update and own their own personal data, I think that's a really strong position to be in as an employer. So add and track and report on additional consent checks where required. Synchronize consent with the relevant information on the employee record. So this really is, again, I'm going to keep saying it, it's about keeping an audit trail. So you need to be able to keep track of all of this stuff and provide a clear and tailored communication and privacy notice to help employees understand their rights and your processes as an organisation. So step number 3, so this is coming back to that individual's right to erasure. The GDPR provides a clear set of rights for your employees, including data rights. So they have the right to be informed, they have the right to complain to supervisory authorities, they have the right to access, rectify or erase their personal data. They can restrict and object to certain types of processing. So this means you must give your people full visibility of the data you hold about them and comply with any access requests within 30 days. It's also your responsibility to keep them informed about their personal data. So you'll be required to make certain pieces of information available, such as the identity and contact details of the data controller and any data protection officer, recipients of their data, how long you store their data for, the right of the individual employee. So there's a lot of considerations when it comes to the rights they have to their own data. So GDPR gives employees the right to see their data, know how it's being used, and ask to change it. As an employer, you'll need to protect and facilitate these rights. Key considerations for right to erasure are: enable employees to access and modify their own personal data, records, and documents on any device at any time. In the age we're living in, having access to an app where they can do this on the go is becoming more commonplace. Capture, facilitate, and track employee requests to view, change, or erase personal data. So it's that audit trail again. Identify and export personal data easily upon request. I'll go into that in a bit more detail in a second. And deliver tailored communications to inform employees of any privacy or data updates they might need to know. Remember, they must always be informed, so you need to make sure that you are making sure that they are tailored communications, are specific to them, and it's anything that's important about any privacy or data updates. And you need to link to relevant policy documents and notifications with employee records, and provide a trail of how data is being used and shared for auditing and tracking purposes. So step number 4, allow for data portability. EU citizens may, upon request, obtain and reuse their personal data for their own purposes. For example, they may wish to move, copy, or transfer certain of their personal data to their next employer. So to comply with this, employers must provide the data in a format that can be easily consumed by other systems as required, and the information must be provided free of charge. So before you used to be able to sort of pay a fee or ask the employee to pay a fee to get access to this type of thing, but that can't happen anymore. It must be provided free of charge. When exporting and transferring personal data for a particular individual, you must take care that the data doesn't contain personal data or compromise data privacy for other employees. For any requests that are submitted, you must respond as reasonably possible within 1 month of receiving the request, so that's 30 days again. And companies will need to make personal data truly portable and easy to use by others so that individuals are able to take it with them. Key considerations for portability are clearly identify all personal data and how it's being processed, set up processes for extracting and exporting personal data by those with the appropriate permissions to do so. Ensure that personal data can be exported to open machine readable formats such as CSV, and automate workflows so that notifications are automatically sent to confirm the status of an employee's portability request. So it's not something that can just get forgotten about. Oh, you know, someone's leaving, they've requested portability of their data. You need to track the date that that was requested and perhaps have notifications set up for your HR team if every 5 to 7 days to check on the progress of that request, and then you can communicate with the data subject the progress of that request also if it's not as simple as just getting it done and turned around quickly. So again, it's just coming back to that transparency. So step number 5, ensure the right to be forgotten. Data subjects can, upon request, ask companies to stop processing and delete their personal data where consent was given, or where the data is no longer necessary for the purposes for which it is collected. So this is the individual's right to erasure, also known as the right to be forgotten. The right to be forgotten is one of the biggest changes brought by GDPR. So as well as one of the hardest to manage, put simply, it means you'll need to have a consistent policy in place for deletion of personal data when it is no longer needed. This might mean erasing some personal data as soon as the employee has left, for example, if you haven't got any grievances or anything that's outstanding. The right to be forgotten is a key part of the new GDPR rules. You need to ensure that there is a consistent policy in place, for thorough identification and deletion of data. So if you're using more than one HR system, for example, how do you ensure that it's removed from one HR system? So you might have something that you use for recruitment, whereas you might have something else that you use for HCM. So do you have a checklist that checks all of these systems? Is it a manual process? Is there something that can be automated to ensure that all personal data has been deleted? So these are the processes and the things that you need to document. And once you start documenting them, you'll be able to build out workflows that ensure that this is done in an efficient manner. So step number 6, keep your people data safe and secure. To prepare for GDPR, you need to document and secure all of the personal data you hold, including information on where it came from and who you share it with. So this is difficult when data is held across numerous spreadsheets, when you use multiple products containing people data such as payroll, workforce management, or learning management systems. So gathering and storing personal data in a single secure database is the building block that everything else rests upon. Once your people data is held in a single, secure and verified database, it becomes a definitive source of information for everyday requests, helping to streamline HR processes, as well as helping to meet some of your compliance obligations. So establishing a single source of truth, which is safe, secure, consistent and verifiable, is the key consideration here. But other things to think about is storing data in a single cloud-based source of the truth, which also gives the ability to give access to employees themselves so they can manage their own personal data with ease. Tailor data access and control by role. So as well as global and local levels, you can have certain levels. So you might have HR admins, and you might have manager admins, and you'll have different levels of what information can be seen by whom. Again, this is something that you need to track and audit. So you can set those permission levels correctly and make sure that individuals can't see potentially another data subject's personal information, which they might not want to see, like we mentioned earlier. So religious beliefs might be something that should not be shared. That's something that they want to keep very secure and not share widely with the team. So there's certain elements of an employee's record that you need to think about what can be seen by others, what level of access should people across the organisation see. But if you enable cross-departmental visibility for HR teams wherever to improve ease of data processing, that's great, but it's just keeping a track of it. Easily identifiable personal data that might need to be removed or distinguished from data held for legitimate purposes. So you might actually have that you need to submit data subjects data for tax purposes. So that's a legitimate purpose for having that data and keeping that data. But again, I'm using this example, a religious belief, the day that employee leaves your organization, do you need to track that for any reason? Potentially not. So that's something that you could delete. So it's working out what fields are legitimately required and what are almost sort of nice to have, which helps you run your business more effectively for different purposes. But actually, once that employee's left or they've asked to have that data removed, it's not imperative that your organization has it to run the day-to-day operations of the business. And ensuring robust data integration, so imports and exports, or for linking people data seamlessly with third-party data sources. So if you do integrate multiple systems, make sure that that data flow is secure and it works seamlessly, so there's nothing that can go amiss. So just to recap on those, the 6 steps to becoming GDPR ready are, so having a lawful basis for processing data, have the right consent in place at each level of the employee journey. So you'll have different consent for a candidate than you would potentially once your employee started. So at what levels do you need which consent? So why don't you map out your employee journey to figure that out? 3, ensure individual rights to access. 4, allow for data portability. 5, ensure the right to be forgotten. And 6, keep your people data safe and secure. So I'm going to run one last poll here just to ask our audience. So what step will you prioritize? And obviously we have to prioritize all of these steps to ensure that we're GDPR ready, but I'm interested to see what you have thought is the most important step to prioritize to get underway with GDPR readiness. So we've got lawful basis and right consents, we've got data access, data portability, right to be forgotten, and data security. Yeah, as I mentioned, they are all important. We have to do all of them, but I'm curious to see which one has been the priority. Cool, thank you. Let's see what we've got. Okay, which makes sense. If I was a HR leader, it's probably the option that I would go for. It kind of underpins everything that you do from an employee perspective. So the lawful purpose, having a contract in place, what consents you have. So, okay, great. That's wonderful. Thank you for taking the time to answer that. So what's next? As I mentioned earlier, GDPR comes into effect this Friday. It's not going anywhere. It's definitely a regulation that's here to stay, and I think it's a really positive step towards building a data privacy culture worldwide, which hopefully, it is a EU regulation, but I think the rules that have been put in place for this expand beyond just the EU. As they have said, it could be any person that's residing in the EU. I think it's going to start impacting if companies outside of the EU are tracking data of employees in the EU and vice versa, because they have to transfer data. It's going to become worldwide, and I think that's great. But to help you along your way and to prioritize a data privacy culture across your business, we have a GDPR ebook, which has these steps in it, but with a bit more detail. And included in that, we have a complete HR readiness checklist, which is really great. Just, a lot of you said at the beginning there that you were prepared, some not quite so prepared, but this checklist is great to go through, so you can just tick off and see what you have and maybe what you might not have done, or maybe you're performing really well and you've done them all, which is great news. But that's a nice little checklist to go through to see if you're missing anything. Cool. Okay, well, I'm going to hand over to Carol, who's going to see if we've got any questions for me today.
Thank you, Grania. We actually have quite a few questions that are coming in. Yeah, and if we don't have enough time to answer all those questions today, please rest assured that we'll have a member of our team reach out to you and try to respond to you shortly. So with that, I'm going to start with the first question. Is May 25th a hard deadline? Will the regulator cut us some slack if we're not quite ready by then?
So I think it is a hard deadline. However, as long as you're working towards being GDPR ready, I think that's the most important things. Full liability for non-compliance does kick in at that point, but if you've been working toward this, and we've got customers who've been working towards this for the last year or two, it's not an easy thing, and it's a tall order for a lot of people. So as long as you're showing steps towards being compliant, you're starting to build those audit trails and thinking about privacy by design, I think you should be okay. Obviously, don't take my word for it, get some legal advice, but I think as long as you're showing steps towards taking these rules into consideration and how it's affecting your organization and the process that you have, and you can document all this, because what they'll do is they'll come in and they will start to audit what you're doing. So they're going to be looking for all of those processes, those checkboxes, those different areas of consent. So those are the really important things to just keep in mind. I think it will be something that's ongoing. I can't see it going away for a long time. And actually, I think companies, especially maybe smaller companies that might have left this to the last minute a little bit, will still be working towards this for some time to come, and things will change. Technology develops, everything changes. So you might get a new technology in place, or something will change in the way that your organization works. So you have to pare it right back. So what are the processes? How is this affecting things? And as long as you've got that at the forefront of your mind when you're starting new projects or processes, then you'll be in good stead.
Perfect. Thank you, Grania. So the next question we have is, how can your solution assist my GDPR compliance?
Ooh, okay. So I mentioned a couple of times there just having the ability to give your employees the right to access their own data. So, for example, we have a self-service portal. So employees log into this and they can go in and they can book their holiday, and they can see what communications have gone out from the organization. So you might have a message from the CEO, or you might have a privacy policy that needs reading. And what you can actually do is have those displayed on the homepage when they log in. You can actually make sure the employee confirms that they read it by having a checkbox, then this notifies HR that this person has actually read this privacy policy, and you can set notifications up. So a few days before GDPR, like this week, would be a good time to send one out to your HR leaders and say, right, these 10 people haven't confirmed that they've read the privacy policy, so you can send a note out to them to give them a bit of a kick up the bum. Employees can go in and actually, whatever you decide to give them the right to change. So if it's something really simple, like they've got a new bank or they've changed banks, so they want to upload new bank details, why shouldn't they be able to do that themselves? So you can give them access to that so they can update that information. But again, you can make sure that this notifies someone in HR so they can confirm this request. So when it gets to the time around to do payroll, that they can confirm this has been done, and things like that. So it's really about making processes more visible to the employee, but you as the employer still have control over what they can see and what they can do and how this impacts the HR team. I think the other thing to note is that we are built on the Salesforce App Cloud, and Salesforce, they're known for about all their security compliances and what a reliable system that they are. So that's really important for us, and that's great for us because then we kind of take all of that and provide that to our customers too.
Thank you, Grania. I think that answers the next question. Where is my data stored with your solution? I believe the answer to that is with Salesforce, right?
Yes. So when I was referring to the classification, so we are a data processor, so is Salesforce. So they are also a data processor because we are built on their platform. They host all of the data, and they have got a really resilient cloud infrastructure. So they've been configured to be hosted within Europe or globally, it depends, but the requirements have all been met for them internationally, and they've got some great articles which you can go and read and just find out more information about their data privacy culture as well. But I think they're probably one of the technology companies that are leading the way for that, and they've got some huge companies that are built and use Salesforce apps, and like banks and whatnot that have to meet those really strict compliance and requirements.
Perfect, thank you. Another question, is consent required from applicants for employment, or is the basis performance of contract? So
it's ask the question again, just so I get that right.
I think the question is does an applicant have to consent for information to be stored on them?
Yes, they do. So that's why it might not actually by that point be lawful processing, because you as an organization you don't necessarily have lawful right for processing at that point because you don't have an employee contract in place. So when it's an application, you might get emailed an application through your website or from a recruiter. You need to make sure that you have consent to pass that application on to whichever team member in your team needs to review that application. So you might be hiring for a head of marketing role in London. You need to capture consent that the applicant is willing to have their data stored by your company, but also processed by your company, because what you're going to end up doing is probably uploading it into your HCM system, or you're going to pass it around to a few people in your team because you want to get second opinions of applications to find out who the best one is. You're going to have it held potentially in different systems, so it's really important to capture that consent. There's some really nice ways that you can do that. We've actually just released some videos on how you can do that with our system, and it's just, again, it's about having transparency in place. And people are going to come to expect this. So if you have to reach out to them and say, we need your explicit consent for this, this, and this, and this is what we're going to be doing with your CV or resume, then people are going to now naturally come to expect that, because it's all about building this data privacy culture across your business, across organizations, and it's not going to be something which I think will become a blocker. So you don't need to worry about it from that point. You just need to make sure that you're doing it in a very transparent way. And I think, yeah, it goes towards looking at an organisation that handles and respects their employee information and also potential candidate information. So it's important to outline those properly.
Perfect, thank you. Okay, next question. Does giving access to personal data also include performance appraisals?
Well, so an employee's right to access their information, you can, once they've requested this right, it's something which you need to talk about within your organisation, because it very much depends what the situation is. Generally, I think performance information should be transparent again, but of course a lot of people do, they get peer-to-peer feedback which you can't see other people's recognition, or if they have something which might not have been a positive piece of feedback, and they, there's certain things that you need to think about. Well, actually, do they have a right to access that information? Because you are capturing that information for lawful processes, because performance is, it's about running your business and making sure you've got good performers working within your organization and how you go about doing that. So there's some cases which you don't necessarily always have to give access. And I think, again, you just need to think about it from your point of view. What information is potentially held there? What's the implications of providing that information? Again, I think it is about being transparent. So, they should be able to access their performance stuff, but there might be some things that you don't give them access to, but as long as you have a reason for this, I think that's fair enough. And as long as that gets tracked and audited, you're in a good position. But it's, again, something which I think is unique to potentially a lot of organizations. So it depends on what that performance information looks like and what exactly they're asking for. But I think you can definitely provide some of it for sure, but it will be unique depending on the organization. So that's something that's probably worth a good conversation, and documenting everything and creating that audit trail. And then whenever someone does ask, you already have that information to hand, so you can say, yep, here you go, here's this. If they come back and say, no, actually I was looking for something like this, and they say, well, actually we can't provide that information because of X, Y, and Z. So it's just about being transparent and having clear processes in place.
Perfect. We're getting a lot of questions with regards to how people can access the ebook and the HR readiness checklist. We can email that out to you. HR.com will send out an email with the recording, and we'll make sure that that's included in that email as well. So for all those questions, you'll receive that shortly after the webinar concludes. And Grania, I think it might be time just for one more question. Again, I apologize to everyone. There are many, many questions, but rest assured, we will make sure that someone reaches out to you to respond to these questions in a timely manner after the webinar concludes. So one last question. Sorry, I already read that one. Oh, what is this one? What is open machine formats?
Oh, well, as far as I'm aware, if we're talking about data portability, it's just about having it in a format that another machine can read. So I think the example I used earlier, which is pretty standard when it comes to exporting data from anything nowadays, is like CSV format, and it just lays it out in a really nice table. I'm not very technical, so I'm probably not putting this in the technical speak, but in a nice table that another machine can just upload that information and it formats it correctly.
Perfect. We have one more minute quickly, so I will ask one last question. There's quite a few questions that are coming in. GDPR is obviously an EU legislation, but yes, how does that affect the US and Canada as well?
Well, it depends if you're processing if you might have an office in Europe with employees in Europe. So are you processing any of that data? Are you transferring any data from that office to your US or Canadian office? Do you potentially have any, I'm trying to think of the word and I can't think of it, that's like graduated from university that might be coming over to work with you, or vice versa. So you need to think about that. You might be accepting candidates from another country to come and work for you. So it's all about whether you're processing data of any EU member states. So for whatever reason, so potentially if that position arises, you need to think about that. And yeah, if you've got offices in those EU member states, you are more than likely going to be transferring data from one office to your US or Canadian office, for example. So you need to have GDPR compliance in mind and be GDPR ready, so you can meet those requirements of the data that's being processed by someone who lives in one of those EU member states.
Great, thank you, Grania. And I guess you never know when the rules like this can also be changed for Canada or the US. We know that's happened before, so
yeah, it might well do.
Awesome. Thank you, Grania. I guess for that, I'll pass it back to hr.com.
Well, thank you so much to Sage Business Cloud people for presenting this very informative webcast today. Just a few reminders for the attendees. If you would like to view this webcast again, the archive recording will be available on site for up to 7 days for our free members and anytime for our recertification members. Slides are also available to download. Your webcast credits are stored in your HR.com account. Watch for your email to arrive within 1 to 2 business days. It will contain the certification credit information. Your feedback is important to us. Please take a moment and fill out the exit survey that will appear on your screen. This concludes our webcast. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye.